Thank you very much, Nana, and welcome to everyone. The poem I am bringing to you is titled, Reimagining Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. You never know how strong you are until you face pressure you have never faced. Wise words of a man with silver hair, describing to me the tales of this movement. Dazed and yet unfazed by their surroundings, as the innuendos cast by their detractors. This, a storied tale of South Kingsmen, diasporan women, and brothers and sisters united by ideas and the dignity of the Homo sapien. Theirs is the quest to redefine the logic of organic development, rewriting and annotating the rules of engagement, no longer ascribing to the white wisdom of northern foster fathers, rediscovering the ancient philosophies and truths buried in sacred hills and oracles, rechanneling the birthing pain of the ghetto of yesteryears into ambition, baptizing every beast, man and woman into apostles of progress and innovation. This movement has found the hidden gems to illuminate our path to progress. They have discovered the antidote to cure our frailties as a collective. Now in our bruised hands, we hold the balm for century-old wounds of inaction and indecision. Now in our hearts and the minds, the unspoken agenda lays siege to our consternation. From this moment, on every rooftop, the war drums of this peaceful message will delight every progressive ear, but disrupt the demons of every obstructive soul. And verily, our work is cut out. Much remains undone. Yet again, I repeat, we must dissolve the artificial borders and mental gates that telepathically keep us apart. Sow the seeds of this righteous rebellion into the psyche of this evanescent generation. Weave the banner of self-belief as a firmament that engulfs the broken skies of our society. And finally, discard our own indignations to birth the imaginations and inclinations of the community. How shall we define ourselves then? No. How do we want to be remembered by the community, a movement, a network, a nation? No. We are the reawakened consciousness, the reimagined nation of you, me, and they, the ones upon whose shoulders the globe rests. It's a great responsibility. The die is cast. Still less.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you very much, Jim. Reawakened consciousness. Thank you very much. And now let's delve a little deeper into why we are here. The world as we've known it has changed dramatically since INGO started to become a prominent actor on the global stage. And so in recent years, INGOs have been challenged from all sides, both externally and internally. Internally, issues around gender, race, power, they've all been in the headlines in recent years. And externally, we have the climate change to global inequality, conflict, and global pandemic seem to have left INGOs unable to truly respond with sufficient efficacy to change the status quo, in spite of their ambition to do so. Like others in civil society, INGOs have faced the challenge of shrinking civic space. It's affected us all, while also failing to respond to the crisis. Both the credibility and the effectiveness of the INGO model have come into question. And organizations in what we now, for convenience sake, refer to as the Global South, for one, question their legitimacy or talk about the challenges of the white savior complex. They rightly question the higher salaries given to international expatriates, the lack of soundness and people of color in leadership positions throughout the sector, alongside the lack of resources flowing to the global south and the devaluation of knowledge and capacity from the global south. Ideas are often considered to be imposed, and partnerships are perceived to be unequal and uncollaborative. And at the heart of these questions are the questions of power and legitimacy. Despite decades of debate about how to ensure that people affected get to determine and design the solutions to the problems they face, many INGOs have insufficiently altered their practice to make this a reality instead of consolidating their hold on power, influence, and access to resources. And many of the longer standing INGOs are acutely aware of the challenges they face. And there have been a number of efforts by international civil society organizations to address the critiques. Some of them, the things that have happened include decentralizing the organizations, seeking to address safeguarding issues, developing more participatory funding mechanisms, etc., etc. But these responses have not revolutionized the international civil society sector. Many of them are technocratic responses to a more fundamental and political challenge. And those within the Shift the Power movement, for example, often refer to INGOs as blockers to their efforts. So our starting point is that we need global civil society. It's not that we do not need global civil society. Why? I mean, the accessibility to global decision-making spaces, cross-learning, sharing of knowledge across boundaries that values everyone's input, north and south. We all need each other. There's an Akan proverb that says that the right hand washes the left and the left the right. Each needs the other. And it is that interdependence that we need in a world faced with major global challenges that need all hands on board to tackle them. But the model that we have now for INGO seems no longer fit for that purpose. So along came RINGO in the latter part of 2020. RINGO is the first globally coordinated cross-sectoral effort. It's a systems change process to reimagine the sector by interrogating the purpose, the structures, the power, and the positioning of INGOs. And you would come to see as we go through the rest of the days, the drivers and the enablers of this project, the core team, the facilitation experts, the advisory board members, the lab members, and a host of other interested parties who have supported the process so far. And as a project, RINGO is all about less talk, more action, action that truly transforms. We said enough is enough. We are ready for change. So when we set out, we did not want to assume anything. And so we set out to gauge what organizations working in the international development space, especially those that had to work with INGOs, really thought about them and the partnerships that they had. And the voices from the Global South survey, I'm sure a link will be posted in the chat very soon, gave us that baseline. And we looked at certain questions. We identified 7 inquiry themes. And if you can please share the screen, share the slide on the inquiry themes for us, please, our tech team. The social lab team, which comprised about 55 people from around the world who met the criteria for membership and were willing to commit the needed time, formed the inquiry teams around each of these 7 themes, asking critical questions around them, these themes. They were asking what is happening, what is causing stuckness, and what are the possibilities for change now. So these are the themes: patriarchy and feminist leadership, structural racism, collaboration and solidarity, resource flows, INGO impact, governance and accountability, and incentives. And this resulted in a report that we are really very proud of. If you are interested to know what was uncovered through the inquiry process, which was at the very beginning, the link to the report is being pasted into the chat right now. And when you have time, please look at it. It's a very rich report. Now, what we learned about possibilities for change became 8 areas of innovation, with one of them that was adopted. And we will now share those areas of innovation as well. One was a new approach to risk sharing and compliance management between funders, INGOs, and local CSOs. The pledge for change. This was a process that was already underway, led by ADESO, a Southern-led learning and accountability mechanism that shifts the accountability equation and redresses power imbalances in the sector. Participatory grant making that disrupts power relations, language and lexicon to replace problematic development language and enable people use their mother tongue when communicating with funders. Decolonizing advisory platform, an online platform that will match organizations in the global north with experts from the global south who provide decolonizing advice and support. An alternative solidarity model which challenges INGOs to listen, learn, and respond to strategic issues emerging from the Swazi struggle through a reverse call for proposals. And tying aid, ending the long-standing practice of tied aid that sees donors prioritize their own domestic INGOs over southern or local civil society. And then climate justice, enabling local organizations to take the lead in addressing the issues, large-scale climate solutions. So we liken these to seeds that need planting in a fertile soil and careful tending. Now they are saplings. From seeds, they've grown into saplings, but as you can see, there's still a lot more tendering that needs to be given to it for it to grow fully and yield fruits. The issues are complex, what we found, but they are not unresolvable, and we are finding some answers. And that is why we are here. This is what the Learning Festival is all about, sharing what we are learning, and inviting you into co-creative sessions to learn together and map next level inquiry and innovation for change. So how will we be doing this and what should you expect? Each prototyping team would host an Innovative Edge session over the coming days. We invite you to register for and join those Innovative Edge sessions to hear more about what the teams are learning and also add your voice. Then after the Innovative Edge sessions, we will be followed by a series of Map the Change sessions, which will focus on 4 different areas where change is really needed: funding, INGO governance, accountability, and solidarity. We bring together what we are learning in RINGO with the innovative work in the wider community, because this is not just a RINGO thing, it concerns us all. Please join these sessions to collectively map the change we want to see across the ecosystem. And throughout the Learning Festival, we have sprinkled different things: open space sessions, fireside chats, coffee mornings, and even a shared meal with the members of your household who are curious about what we are up to. And all of these informal gatherings are for deeper conversation, community building, and emergent learning. So please sign up for these sessions on the WUVA platform. So as you can see, there's a lot on the menu to suit everyone's palates, as well as your time schedules. So please, please, please join us. This is a learning festival. It's not only sharing what we've learned from the RINGO process so far, but we also want to learn from you. So to start us off with hors d'oeuvres, it is my sole honor to introduce to all of us 2 seasoned actors and activists in the international development space. They will be setting the context for us and sharing some of their reflections on this, as well as the prospects for transformative change using vehicles like RINGO. Let me start with Eva Joyce and then move on to Peter. We will have 20 minutes for both of you to share your nuggets of wisdom with us. And then if we have a chance, we'll take a couple of questions from our audience for a few minutes before we wrap up. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce Eva Joyce Wynne, or EJ, as many of us call her. She served as ActionAid International's Global Head for Women's Rights between 2002 and 2011, which resulted in the transformation of that INGO's work across some 45 countries to be feminist and rooted in women's human rights. She was Oxfam Canada's Associate Country Director in Zimbabwe, and between 2014 and 2020, EJ served as ActionAid's International Director for Programs and Global Engagement. And in this role, she led several programs, advocacy campaigns, and supported the whole AAI Federation in its program with local movements and partners, particularly with women's rights and young people's organizations across some 45 countries. In 2020, Eva Joyce was appointed Professor of Practice, Women's Rights by the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. EJ contributes as an advisor to feminist organizations and movements, including the African Feminist Forum and Just Associates. And she co-founded and served on the boards and leadership of several civil society and women's rights organizations in different parts of the world and in Zimbabwe. EJ is currently the executive director of the SHINE campaign. And our next speaker would be Peter Walton. Peter is the Chief Executive Officer of CARE Australia, joining CARE Australia in January 2020. He has 30 years of international experience seeking better outcomes in both international development and humanitarian activities. And during his career, he has undertaken assignments in over 50 countries, including being based for 7 years in Vietnam, where he was a regional representative for operations across the Mekong region for Child Fund Australia. During this time, he was awarded the Vietnam government's Medal for Peace and Friendship, the highest award offered to foreigners for services towards social development and poverty alleviation. Peter has held a number of senior roles in the humanitarian sector, development sector, including International Director with Save the Children Australia and Chief Executive of an enterprise that uses technology in support of social impact and social justice. And immediately prior to joining CARE Australia, Peter was the International Director with Australian Red Cross and led a transformation of its approach to better equip the organization to maximize its impact and evolve in rapidly changing environment. He's a lead advocate for reform in the sector and ensuring that aid is genuinely locally led. He has a strong interest in appropriate innovation and new forms of partnership and humanitarian financing. EJ and Peter, you are welcome. And our questions for you, I will just ask the questions and ask that you speak to them. 10 minutes, EJ, and 10 minutes for Peter. So tell us from your experience how you would describe the context that we find ourselves in. And for you, the moments that really jolted you to the realization that something is just not right within the system that we are in. And what is it that has pushed us? Why is the change now? What's it that has pushed us to really tackle the issue this time around through programs like RINGO? What has changed? And finally, it will be great to hear from you what should excite us about this process, RINGO and processes like RINGO that is going on, and where do you see the prospects going forward? So EJ, I'll start with you. Please go ahead.
Good morning, evening, afternoon, everybody, and thanks so much, Nana, for that generous introduction. You refused to follow my bio, which I had sent you. All I wanted you to say and summarize in one sentence: she's been around for far too long and she needs to retire. So sometimes that's how I feel. So thank you so much. Let me just get straight into it. It is the best of times, it is the worst of times. It's an exhilarating moment to be alive and seeing so much change and so much organizing and so much of people claiming their power. But at the same time, it is a scary time when we see the resurgence of authoritarianism, conflicts, and all the crises that we could ever think of converging at the same time. So that's kind of the theme that I want to run with, that is this exciting moment. There are all these positive things that are really happening. But at the same time, there are these counter forces, there are these counter trends that we are seeing. And so as NGOs, as INGOs, this is the context that we must navigate. And I don't think there is particularly anything that's unusual that we haven't experienced before, but I think this moment is characterized by the fact that a lot of the issues that we have tended to deal with, particularly as INGOs, have tended to come at us one at a time. This time, everything you can think of is kind of converging at the same time. And so it requires us to think differently, to organize differently, how we do the work that we do. So what are these counter trends that I'm seeing? So one is there is so much talk about movement building, and you see a lot of movements organizing. And at the same time, as I said earlier, we are seeing the resurgence of authoritarianism. You just have to look at the Philippines, where they just returned the Marcos family to power. You just have to look at the military coups in West Africa. It's open season again for coups, it appears. And let's not forget the coup in my own country in 2017, which was called a coup, but not a coup. right? We've seen the fact that after COVID, a lot of the kind of militaristic interventions that governments put in place, the laws, the policies, the stopping of people moving around, some of those laws and policies are still in place, and they are being used to the maximum in some places where we know. We've had so many elections in so many countries. In my region in Africa, it's an election a month. But at the same time, there is so little democracy and little democratic outcomes for the majority of people that you and I care about. As I say, there's so much frontline organizing, movements coming together, from fighting against extractives to organizing for climate adaptation, to Black Lives Matter, to Me Too, right? To just name a few, to Fees Must Fall. We've seen a lot of these movements. We've seen a lot of people come together, and that's been exciting. That has showed the power that the people have, the agency that people have, and that at moments when it's critical, people will come together, and they don't need someone to organize them, as we have seen in the case of Iran more recently, right? It didn't take an NGO sitting down and writing a project proposal and someone reviewing it in Brussels or in New York. But people have started organizing, and we have had to follow behind, I think, as NGOs and as INGOs, right? But at the same time, again, we see the capture of our states, the capture of space, the capture of resources by the elite, by corporates, the way the fossil fuel industry has captured the climate space. And you will see it next week when COP opens. I work in renewable energy access. I can't tell you how every day I sit there with my eyes popping, just listening to the amounts of money that they talk about, the billions that they say we need for renewable energy access. And I say, honestly, really? Don't we just need one little generator and to power up the local clinic, and a light in every household, and a plug for a blender so that the women don't need to spend so much time doing this work? But it seems somehow that's the big conversation, the big money, and we are waiting for the big projects to happen, right? So the conversation is largely about the big and shiny, and it's not so much about the practical, the real, that you and I are concerned about in terms of the people that we work with. Another exciting trend for me is everybody in the NGO sector, particularly in INGOs, has become a feminist leader. We have all suddenly discovered feminism. I love the way the words just seem to roll off everybody's tongue so easily. And one has to wonder, how come saying you're a socialist doesn't flow so easily from our tongues? How come saying I'm a leftist as a leader of an INGO, right? How come it just doesn't come out? You feel gagged. I'm a socialist activist, development practitioner. We don't hear that more often, but it's very interesting. We are all for feminist leadership. As a feminist leader, my goodness. Anyway, to be fair, to be nice to us, it is wonderful to see. It is great to hear people embracing feminism. This is what some of us have been fighting for decades. But one has to worry, right? One has to worry, given the trends that we've seen in the sector, right? The safeguarding scandals of the last few years, and that seemed to continue. What's really happening in communities, what's happening to women's sexual and reproductive health rights, right? And so for me, that's another one of those, again, positive, but one has to wonder. We've also become great decolonizers. Now there's another word for you. Flows so easily from every one of us's mouth. Decolonizing aid, decolonizing our sector, decolonizing. Okay, again, let me say, I'm not knocking all of us. I'm just saying it's wonderful to hear. Let me affirm that. It is wonderful to see. It is great to see the momentum, particularly that has been generated by the RINGO initiative. And I don't mean to play that down, but I'm just saying, as a sector, we have this tendency, right, to get so excited and to got caught up in our own rhetoric and in our own big words, that at the end of the day, when you look back, when we look 5 years from now, what is that actually going to translate into? And how does it change our practice? So much diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, there's another one, although I do like to call it diversion, equity, and inclusion, but that's a conversation for another day. And yet, at the same time, we see so little justice, right? So again, that's something I want us to interrogate and say to ourselves, indeed, it is important in our sector to have DEI. It is indeed commendable to see people now being appointed full-time, budgets being made available. But what is that actually translating to in terms of the structural change, that we need to see? So much religion and so little love. I don't think I need to explain that. In my part of the world, the rise of Christian fundamentalism is a cause for concern. And we have already seen some of the impacts of that Christian fundamentalism in Brazil in the last few years. I am singling out Christian fundamentalism because I think as a sector, we have been comfortable to talk about Islamic fundamentalism, which of course the media, the mainstream talks about, but in many of the places where we work and in many of our civil society organizations, the impact of Christian fundamentalism is something that we have yet to deal with in terms of its impacts on women's rights, on the rights of young people, on the rights of marginalized, minoritized groups, but also to recognize that that Christian fundamentalism is embodied in some of our leadership within the sector, right? Just one example. Every NGO meeting has to start with a Christian prayer for the why. Who told you that we are all Christians? What does that mean exactly, and how does that translate into our programs? Finally, localization, 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 our favorite word of the moment. Again, wonderful. But in my usual cynical fashion, I always have to ask, as opposed to what exactly? What other alternative is there than to work with local people, to listen to them, to support them in their fight? Because that is the reason that we exist. We don't exist because we want to exist. We exist because people somewhere have a problem, and our role is to support in addressing those problems. And those people are, for lack of a better word, living in their locales. And that's another word we need to change, localization. There is a local everywhere, right? There isn't just a local in the global south, but again, that's a conversation for another day. So what am I saying? I am saying there are these counter forces, in the world. It's an exciting time, but it's a scary time. Fortunately, RINGO has come along and has helped us to open some of these discussions amongst ourselves. It has enabled us to look at ourselves in the mirror and realize, actually, we don't like ourselves that much. But this truth was already there, right? If we are honest. I don't think for me, there's been a moment where I'm like, Eureka, this is it. I think all of us have seen it coming. Some of us much faster than others, but certainly it's been coming. I think I just want to point out, if you look at a lot of the people mobilizations that have happened across the world in the last 5 years, including during COVID time, right? Particularly during COVID time, by the way. If there was ever a moment that our sector has been rendered irrelevant, it was during COVID. But we had seen this coming, right? In many of the countries, people are organizing, they're coming together locally, nationally, they're coming across together, on the internet. They don't need us. Yes, we've been supportive. Yes, we still play a role. But actually, if we are to be honest with ourselves, time and time again, we are being reminded that if we continue to work the way that we're working, if we continue to treat people that we work with the way we treat them, we are going to be irrelevant. And this has already happened. And it's not just about money, right? So what does this mean? It means we need to go back to basics, right? To allow us to value and rebuild the agency of people to confront the negative trends that I've talked about earlier. It means we need to organize differently, both online and offline, particularly offline. I think we have tended far too much to place emphasis on what happens online. I think we need to go back to the basics, door to door, human to human, and have those conversations that are difficult under the proverbial tree. We need to recover and improve on the best approaches of our sector. I think for me, this is one thing that I find very kind of concerning, because when I entered this sector 100 years ago, right, we talked about participatory rural appraisal. We talked about popular education and the methodologies that Paulo Freire taught us. We saw stepping stones in terms of the response to HIV and AIDS. I could name many of these approaches. And all of them were rooted in the belief that people who suffer from injustices are their own liberators. All we are there to do is to meet them in the place where they are and support them to get out of those situations. So we need to recover that history, that momentum, that we played a role in disrupting as a sector. And I think it's important to do a mea culpa in terms of that, and then move on to say, what are some of those traditions that we've had that have enabled us to do our work and to behave differently? We need new tools, right, for this moment, because I think, as I said, the convergence of everything at the same time has meant that some of the tools in our toolbox are not helping us. But I need to say this clearly. I am not asking us to create another checklist. I am not asking us to create another manual. I am not asking you to create another module. And I'm saying these things because that's the INGO tendency. Every problem shall be solved by a new tool and a new group of people trained, and we shall worship at the altar of our manual. That's not what I'm asking for. I'm asking for different tools to engage, to work with people, to decolonize, whatever it is that you're talking about, because the tools in our toolbox are insufficient. We need new actors, and we've already seen new actors come on board, right? Particularly in the philanthropy area, which is one area I've been engaging with. So you're seeing these new philanthropists come on board with tons of money, right? One particular philanthropist in the US is giving away $10 million, $20 million to feminist groups. From a situation where we were getting $200,000 for a women's NGO, we suddenly wake up and we have 20 million. And I don't think we quite know what to do with it, but there is a lot to do with it, right? So there are these new actors, new forms of philanthropy, community giving. Nana and others can talk to you about it. So those new actors, we need to be alive to their existence, but actually to their liberatory power that we're seeing in terms of how they're working differently, how they're thinking differently, how they have simplified their methodologies, their rules, their policies, and it's exciting to see. And we as a sector need to come around to that and learn from that and be part of that change that we are seeing. Finally, I'm saying we need to invert the pyramid of this conversation, right? Right now, I see that this conversation has started from the top. I'm not knocking it. It had to start somewhere, and it's great, right? We have planted the seed, as Nana was pointing out earlier. We have opened up many Pandora's boxes, but it is my submission that so far the conversation has been dominated, let me put it crudely, by those of us who hold negative power over others, if we are to be honest about it. So I live for the day when the African country directors of INGO X sit down together and say, this is what decolonizing this INGO is going to look like. I am looking forward to the day when the regional directors, particularly of the indigenous variety, sit down and say, this is our region. These are the problems about how we operate. And this is how we want to change things. And this is how we want to engage with our northern counterparts. I think for me, that is the next step that we need to take this to. And as I said, I would like to see, and I'm challenging my southern leader counterparts that this is our moment. If we stay back, if we continue to feed into other people's agendas, there will never be a moment in which we're going to set the agenda and really define for ourselves the terms of engagement in terms of our relationships with those who currently wield the power that we are questioning. So thank you, Nana, and thank you, Ringo, for this opportunity. And I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, EJ. Thank you very much. Let's go back to the basics. Check our human-to-human connection, the best approaches of our sector. How do we revive those and use them? New tools are needed, new actors, and inverting the pyramid. Thank you so much, Eva Joyce. Now let me invite Peter to share your reflections with us, please.
Well, thank you very much, Nana. Let me start. I'm calling in from Melbourne tonight. And as is tradition here, I'll start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which I'm calling from, which are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And thank you, Eva Joyce. I found myself nodding quite a lot as you were speaking, both nodding around, agreeing with you that we do have an opportunity to seize the moment, but also a moment to really turn rhetoric into action. But I also was rapidly thinking, I hope I don't have too many of these buzzwords in the comments that I'm going to make right now. But as Nana said, my name's Peter Walton. I'm the CEO of CARE Australia, and I am a passionate campaigner for international NGOs really needing to fundamentally change their models. Hence, I very much appreciate the invitation to speak at the RINGO Learning Festival. As was outlined in my bio, I did lead a major shift in the way that the Australian Red Cross embarks on its international work, which was fundamentally around, you can't shift power if you're not prepared to change yourself. You can't shift power and think that you can continuously grow. So that process was fundamentally about downsizing a team and basically providing multi-year core funding to a whole range of local organizations. And it was on the back of that work that I was invited to become CEO of CARE Australia and given a mandate to reimagine how we operate. So maybe if I can start by pausing a little bit and sort of telling you a little bit about my story, and I guess 2 or 3 moments that helped shape a lot of the reasons why I'm so passionate about this and why I think INGOs really need to put their egos and their logos to one side and genuinely listen and genuinely hold themselves accountable to the very values that they profess, because I think that they've actually, in many cases, lost sight. At the start of my career, and probably a little like Eva Joyce, I've been around a long time, some 30 years ago, I would often find myself in parts of West Africa. And I was young, British, naively optimistic, armed with a master's degree. I was out to save the world. And these early visits were really informative, if not, I guess, an epiphany for me, because, the more I talked with people in their communities, it became bleedingly obvious that, these weren't people that needed saving. They needed a level playing field. They needed equality of opportunity. They needed solidarity. And, I was well-intentioned, but frankly, I look back at photos of that time now, and I sort of cringe around the way that I was operating. And it was quite a formative time in my career back in the early 90s. Another pivotal moment for me was in 2015. When I was at the Red Cross, I was absolutely shocked at the same old pattern of aid after Tropical Cyclone Pam devastated the small island of Vanuatu. Now, Vanuatu is a country with approximately 300,000 people. And at the time, Tropical Cyclone Pam was the biggest cyclone to ever hit that country. And by many estimations, over 100 international organizations landed. They bypassed a lot of the so-called capacity building that had been occurring for years. They bypassed the local economy, and all with good intentions, but there was a lot of harm done. And in a number of the speeches that I've actually given for CARE since I joined, I contrasted that scenario with how would a country like Australia or a country like the USA or the UK feel if multiple international organizations landed on their shores and dictated an emergency response to a flood, a bushfire, or mass migration of refugees, even when they were uninvited, as was the case during the last tsunami in Sulawesi. So at that time, after Tropical Cyclone Pam, I commissioned some research exploring, well, what would a locally led humanitarian system or approach look like in the Pacific region? And importantly, it was undertaken using local researchers, using their own local methodologies. And guess what? They concluded that if an INGO is really serious about being locally led, and I also don't like the term localization, if it is really serious about the phrase as local as possible, as international as necessary, then the overwhelming message was, you need to start by changing yourself. Or as one Pacific Islander said at the time, at times of crisis, what we need is a locally made canoe, but you send in a battleship. So why is this important? Well, I think it is important for, moral or ethical reasons, but also important because of a lot of whatever Joyce just said, the challenges that we face as a common humanity. There is a burning platform to change. And, certainly when it comes to that international aid and solidarity, the global inbox, in my view, is full. We do see extreme weather and climate change. Certainly in this region, Asia Pacific, these events are occurring with greater frequency and greater intensity. And we often joke that, we hear in the media around once in 100-year events that seem to be happening, frequently, every couple of years, if not several times a year. We are seeing increasing inequality, and no country in the world has achieved gender equality or is set to achieve gender equality by 2030. And in fact, all countries still have at least one piece of legislation that discriminates against women. We're seeing more people on the move, fleeing conflict, and we have famine occurring in the 21st century, completely unacceptable and avoidable. And of course, the pandemic, as we all know, has caused an erosion of many of the gains that have been made in recent years. And some would say that, there's a generational reversal in some of these gains. So when I think back to even before COVID, there was a 40% shortfall in humanitarian financing to deal with the crises of 2019. We've had a pandemic, we've got a war in Ukraine, and a global hunger crisis is actually unfolding as we speak, as you all will know. Now, if you fast forward to 2030 and align, with the ambitious sustainable development goals, we're going to have a planet that is 1.5 degrees warmer. There'll be 1 billion more people on it, and you sort of get the picture. It just isn't adding up in terms of, how we will collectively deal with this. And, in my view, I think INGOs have a choice, which is to either positively transform and go back to basics and really work out, what is the role to, try to solve some of these global challenges. They have a choice of purposefully dying well, or I think the path that many are on is frankly, a pathway to die badly and become irrelevant. So, I think there are some big choices to be made. So bearing, I guess, that experience in mind, along with many international NGO leaders, I have become increasingly frustrated that, the status quo has just remained too powerful. And actually, we are increasingly failing the very communities that we say we're seeking to support. And it's why I joined the group, Pledge for Change group, which you'll hear about during this RINGO Learning Festival, and I'll also talk briefly about it shortly. Since 2016 and the World Humanitarian Summit and the Grand Bargain, there has been a lot of rhetoric and very little action by large donors or INGOs around the commitments made, particularly localization or locally led. Those commitments that 25% of humanitarian funding would go directly to local actors. And at the time, I think it was 3 or 4%. Well, I did feel optimistic at the time, but I think, frankly, things have gone backwards. The Grand Bargain may have been a well-intended step in the right direction, at least in principle, but ultimately, I think it has failed in realizing its goals in terms of implementing real action. And actually, the stark inequities of the world right now are a timely wake-up call to change the way that we work together as humanitarians or development practitioners or whatever label you want to give, so that we can genuinely address the root causes of poverty, injustice, and inequality. But it means working together and working differently. So COVID, conflict, climate change, they've all focused attention on these inequities like never before. Black Lives Matters, Me Too, as Eva Joyce was saying, have both quite rightly shone a spotlight on racism, sexism, and discrimination more broadly. And, the international aid sector, despite apparent virtuous intent, is increasingly called out for either being a colonial construct that controls resources and controls decision-making, or one that actually just perpetuates this concept of white saviorism. So where does this leave us? Well, in my view, the burning platform for change has been here for years. The sector and the way it was working was actually ill-equipped to meet the challenges of the day with those old approaches, and actually falls short of many of the longer term challenges that we now are dealing with and those that we anticipate, not least climate change and gender equality, to perhaps state two of the obvious ones. However, in addition to this, I think there is also a compelling burning platform to rise to the ethical and I guess the moral challenge to build a stronger aid system, because we have to work on this together. A lot of the problems we face are truly global, but one that's based on principles of solidarity, of humility, to self-determination. So reimagining international NGO business models, I think, will either come from a moral imperative or strong leadership, or it will just come from crisis. And I think we've got that crisis occurring at the moment. And I think all of these things are converging. And, in many respects, you'd like to think that, just that the global need that we are seeing should be a compelling reason enough to change. But frankly, it hasn't, as we all know. Many of these conversations have been had for years, and change is hard. And I think, what I view is there are so many perverse incentives not to change, so many perverse incentives to maintain the status quo. And I find myself often joking that the department of the status quo is the biggest and it's the most powerful. So, how are we going to overcome that? So what are these perverse incentives? Speaking on behalf of an INGO, I see all too often that the measures of success in organizations, international NGOs, and amongst their boards are still often about continuous growth, market share, often much more than relevance and impact. And perhaps this does reflect on, I guess, the composition of the boards or their skill sets or their backgrounds. But the measures of success aren't really truly aligned with all of the things we're now saying around shifting power. So that's a fundamental challenge. There is unconscious bias in so much of the work that often doesn't support truly equitable partnerships, or indeed doesn't actually present the challenges in truly authentic ways. And far too often, I think INGO self-preservation in very competitive markets often trumps what is the right thing to do, that so many people know is the right thing to do. So we have seen, as Nana, you were saying at the start, INGOs have grown exponentially in recent decades. The infrastructure of head offices, regional offices, country offices is expensive. And typically an INGO will receive a government grant, try and cover a range of costs, and then ultimately drip feed through on a project by project basis, fixed term project funds to a local civil society organization that remains dependent on chasing projects, but often rarely has the resources to plan ahead or to keep the lights on in some cases. So let me pause though, because I do want to say this isn't a beat up of INGOs, who have done some incredible work, but in a broken system. INGOs largely have taken on the perceived or indeed some of the real risks of institutional donors. And clearly, whilst there may be capacity issues with some local organizations, the construct of aid rarely seems to adequately address, well, how do you address this longer term? How do you address this so that point in time assessment isn't something that will be maintained? So we see the myths of, the language of you can't trust local organizations or they don't have the capacity. It comes up far too often as just a reason never to address, how are you going to change that over time? How are you genuinely going to support strengthening local civil society, and what role should you play to shift the needle? And I think a good example of this is, in the Red Cross movement where I was before, the International Committee of the Red Cross it does provide some incredible, impartial, neutral humanitarian services, and often in complex environments. But in, I think, almost 10 of their top crises around the world, they've been operating there for almost 4 decades. So, how do we shift the needle? And what are, I guess, the circuit breakers? So in the Pledge for Change group, we've been talking about this term incremental radicalism. There isn't a quick fix, there isn't a silver bullet. Strong leadership is called for, but there has to be strength in numbers to challenge the status quo and to increasingly demonstrate that there is a different story that can be told. So many of you would have heard about the recently launched Pledge for Change group, and I'm very proud and privileged that over the last 2 years, I've been part of this group of INGO leaders. It was spearheaded by Dagan Ali, who many of you will know, head of the African organization Adesso. And what we're trying to do is really seek to lead by example and work together to bridge that gap between rhetoric into action, actually into real change. And the Pledge for Change recognize.
I'm sorry, I would have to come in here because our time is almost up. I mean, the issues that you are raising are very key, and I'm glad that we are going to have the session on the Pledge for Change to have even more discussions on it. But you've raised some very critical issues. The fact that if we want to shift power, we must change ourselves first. We must look at putting egos and logos aside. I mean, I really like that quote. Change is hard, you said, and there are disincentives, against that kind of change. But yet there's the momentum, and there's a lot of work like the Pledge for Change, like RINGO, that we are currently discussing, that are really looking at changing things and taking advantage of the momentum to change things. Thank you so much. I really would have wished for us to have a lot more time to discuss questions from the audience, but we have run out of time. However, we do have the next few days to answer many of the questions that will be coming up. And there's so much space, all the different aspects of the Learning Festival that has been set up specifically to give us that space to engage and raise our questions. Peter and EJ, I can't thank you enough for doing exactly what we asked you to do. Really pique people's interest, paint the picture as it is for us to address the issues. What a fantastic start to our Learning Festival. Thank you so much. You've given us real food for thought and also to dissect. I want to thank everyone who's joined us, and I do hope that you are inspired to sign up for the sessions throughout the coming 4 days. There are a number of things that will be happening during the course of today, and I asked the tech team to project the agenda slide for today's session. We will go into a 15-minute break now, and then we would hope to see you at our first 2 Innovative Edge sessions immediately after the break. And you'll be able to join by following the link, and it will be posted. The links will be posted also in the chat for us to see. So please take notes of these sessions that are coming up today, and also the links that you can use to join the sessions. Thank you so much for being here and for starting this festival with us. We hope that you are going to stay through with us for the next 4 days. We promise you that there's a lot, don't miss it. Thanks a lot.
Are the session links gonna come up here?
They should be posted here. Yeah, it's been
They've been
posted in the
posted.
chat.
Great, thanks everyone. See you on the other side.
See you,
Hi,
see you.
Nana. Hello,
Bye.
Nana.
Hello.
Hey, any more music when we go for this break?
Yes, we need the music.
Yeah, it was good. Thank you very much. See you later.
I'll see you soon.